You're listening to The Portfolio Composer, hosted by me, Dr. Garrett Hope, where business and creativity go hand in hand. Join us at theportfoliocomposer.com for news, talks, and workshops. This episode is brought to you by Dorico, the music notation software from Steinberg. Dorico Pro 3 is a major new version with game-changing advances in note input, notation, and engraving. Also available from Steinberg is Dorico Elements, an entry-level application that packs all of the essential power of Dorico Pro into a simple, streamlined package that is ideal for those getting started. Find out more later in the show. Welcome to episode 237 of the Portfolio Composer podcast. I am your host and your coach and your teacher, Garrett Hope. And again, I'm so excited that you're listening to this and growing in your understanding of what it means to be a creative, to be a composer in the 21st century. Today's episode shines the spotlight on Jackson Greenberg. Jackson is a Philadelphia-born, LA-based musician, producer, and composer of music for film, TV, and concert ensembles. After graduating with a degree in music from Princeton University and a graduate degree from the University of Southern California Thornton School of Music, Jackson has written original music for many films and television shows, including the Oscar-nominated film Cartel Land. His debut solo EP, First Light, is available on all platforms now. Jackson, welcome to the Portfolio Composer.
Thank you for having me.
So the name The Portfolio Composer is stolen from the business and investment world, where the idea is to have a portfolio of income-producing assets, diversified income. And I think that as an independent small business owner and as a creative individual, that looks similar for composers, because we do different things within our portfolio of activities that generate income. So my first question to you is, what's in your portfolio? What are the things you're doing to make money?
I would say, most of my income is from film and television. And within film and television, music for film and television, specifically original music for film and television. There are a couple different sources of income. But it's funny, when I tell people I do music for film and TV, I think the average layperson is like, oh, you choose music for the shows. And no, my job is 100% writing original music for film and television. And within that, the sources of income are the money that you get up front from a specific production company to do music for a specific show or film. Mm-hmm. Then there still are some pretty substantial back-end royalties depending on the network, which we can get into. And then there are, on each deal for each TV show, there are generally, I think, two types of contracts. One is called a work for hire and one is called a license. Mm-hmm. The way that works is the work for hire is more money up front so that whoever you're writing the music for will own it in perpetuity. Yep. And can do whatever they want for it. And then the license is, they're basically, I'm still making them original music, but I walk away owning it, which means if I do that deal on a TV show, I double my royalty income. And, usually there's a hold period of about a year or two before I can start selling that to other people or make other opportunities.
Right.
And I generally prefer to do that because it saves the client money on the front end, makes me more money on the back end, and then I'm able to build up my library that I can then, turn around and sell to other people.
Yeah. With a long-term mindset, that's definitely more lucrative for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm lucky that the types of projects I'm working on are generally open to that. I think like if you're doing big studio Hollywood films, those type of deals don't exist as much. But the type of projects that I'm doing, I'm happy to do those type of deals right now, which has been great, especially right now during this period of quarantine and with business is slow. I have a lot of music in my library that I'm now licensing out to various opportunities and saving people money up front to think about that longer term financial future.
Yeah, and we can discuss this, but I think the industry is going to have to shift. It's going to look different afterwards. I want to follow up with one of the things you said. It was very interesting because you mentioned how when you're speaking with people, and I kind of imagined an everyday kind of person on the street, and they thought of you more as a music editor. It brought to mind one of my good friends who, this was 15 years ago, but he used to ask his students, who's the most famous living composer? And these are music students, right, who, are studying all these 20th century greats. And most students would say John Williams. And I think if you kind of asked people today, they would say Hans Zimmer, or after the success of the Avengers trilogy, Silvestri.
Yeah.
And that music's great. Those composers do a really good job. But it's funny how even the idea of what a composer is within media is limited to a very small range.
Yeah. I would push back too. I think, John Williams, one of the things that I really love about him is that he's dedicated probably the same amount of time to his concert music and his conducting that he has with his film music. Mm-hmm. Whereas, there's a couple other composers who they just write the music for film and then they tour that music for film, and they haven't really developed that educational side of their film music composing. But yeah, I think most people, when I talk to them, they think of me more as a music supervisor. Like, maybe not so much anymore, but like 10 years ago, it felt like that was the job that everybody wanted. Like when people first started making playlists of like, oh, like I get to just like choose music for this TV show. And I think, music taste is something like driving. Like, isn't there some statistic that's like 90% of people think that they're an above average driver?
Yes.
I think it's the same.
Yeah.
I think it's the same thing with music taste, where like everyone thinks that their music taste is good. So everyone thinks that, given the opportunity, they could put together a good soundtrack for a TV show or a movie. But that's not what I do. So
you'd probably excel at that job too. But you have to give the rest of that statistic. And I can't remember the numbers, but it's 90% of people think they're above average driver, but 75% are way worse than they actually think they are.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's probably true for music too.
And then the conversation inevitably goes to like, no, I write original music. And then most of the time it's like, oh, like the guy from Forgetting Sarah Marshall or Jack Black from The Holiday. Like those are the references that people go by. Or John Williams or Hans Zimmer. But I'm sure Alan Silvestri would be very happy to be put in the same conversation as those two people.
Honestly, some of Silvestri's older soundtracks were very important to me as I was a young developing composer.
Oh, yeah.
Like what he did for Forrest Gump. It just blew me away.
I have a funny story about that Forrest Gump score. My sister got married in December, and she like kind of was asking me to sit in on some of the meetings, like with the DJ, to make sure that he was playing some good music. And he's like, well, what do you think about walking down the aisle to this? And he played the theme song from Forrest Gump. And I'm like, well, that would be a good thing to walk down to the aisle to if you want everybody in the audience to sit there and say like, what is this music from? This theme that will just make everyone try and guess where it's from. So we scratched that, and I think she walked down to a different song. But yeah, Back to the Future, some of his older stuff is incredible.
Oh yeah, Back to the Future too. Okay, so my sister in her wedding, she wanted movie music. So I arranged for string quintet, because I played the bass, and then oboe.
Oh, that's awesome.
When her wedding party walked down, it was to the Concerning Hobbits theme by Shure, right? Ba-da-da-dee-da-da-da. But then when she walked down the aisle, she wanted Gabriel's oboe from The Mission.
Oh, wow.
Ennio Morricone.
Dude,
oh my gosh.
He's incredible.
Yeah.
I think about his music a lot, just on a day-to-day basis in terms of instrumentation.
Well, it's really creative, and he doesn't repeat himself.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like, we can get into this more, but one of the challenges of being a modern film and TV composer is that we all have the same sample libraries, right? And all of these sample libraries are designed to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why a lot of these scores for TV and movies end up using the same instrumentation, because it sounds good and it works and it's cheap to use these libraries and not hire live musicians. But then you go to listen to any Morricone score and, how many people would think to use like a whistle or some of the instruments that he's using on these giant epic films nowadays? We've grown so accustomed to, hearing a giant symphony orchestra play under the Avengers. But that's why people like Tarantino continue to inspire me, because even though he's making films where he's not using original music and composers, he's choosing really interesting music from the past and keeping it relevant, and that style of filmmaking relevant today as well.
Yeah. Well, he also hired Morricone recently.
Yeah, for Hateful Eight, but then I think Morricone said like he would never work with him again or something because he was giving him too many notes and revisions. You'd have to look that up, though.
I imagine that would not be a fun relationship. I don't know. If Quentin Tarantino ever wanted to hire me, I'd probably say yes right away.
Exactly.
So can't say too much. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that, because sample libraries and writing into the DAW are a thing. It's a video game and, all media, really. Because it's a cheaper way to get a good sounding score, and we can get close, but not exactly like a live orchestra. And you can invest. I mean, I know I've invested multiple thousands of dollars into my
Yeah.
libraries, and I could spend 20 grand more and not be done. But you're right. We all sound the same. So, I mean, give me your thoughts on that. What are you doing to differentiate yourself?
This is something that I think about a lot. I try and always reconnect with like why I wanted to do this in the first place. And my background, like growing up in Philadelphia, was, for many years, I thought I was going to go to Conservatory for Jazz Performance. And so most of my music experience was playing live and improvising with other people. And I think in some ways, like I became addicted to that feeling of like live music. And that's kind of informed my philosophy moving forward of like, how can I make, even when I'm by myself in the studio, how can I set myself up to evoke a feeling within myself, and a lot of the times sitting down and playing with sampled strings, like I do that a lot. I'm not writing that off completely, but I think just maybe it's my attention span. Like I just get bored with using the same sounds on every project. So when I went to grad school at the USC Film and TV music program, maybe I'll get into trouble for saying this story, but it was the last day of class. And they're like, okay, does anyone have any feedback for us, moving forward? And just, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the program. And I went first, and granted, I had come from an undergrad program where unless you were doing something that was completely unique, or you could make the argument that it was unique and original, or at least trying to be unique and original, I don't know, sampling goats and running it through tape machines or something, you weren't taken seriously. To then the very next year I was at USC, where our assignments were, here's a scene from this Hollywood movie that came out 10 years ago, rescore it. And then the professor pretended to be the director, giving us notes on what they liked and didn't like. And I think it kind of pushed us all into a very similar box. And granted, they're trying to get us jobs when we graduate. And most people out of that program are going to work for other composers where they need to learn how to sound and write like other people efficiently. But anyways, my feedback was that I wish that they had kind of encouraged us and let us use the safe space of graduate school to explore some of our own more unique ideas, instead of kind of pushing us to sound what Hollywood has sounded like for the last 50 years. And that's where the jobs are. And that's where most of my colleagues and friends from that program are working. And honestly, it's why a lot of them got into it, because they love that music. And I love that music too. But I think for them, a lot of other people in that program, film music and the history of film music was their main focus and their main passion. And for me, I love film. I love certain scores. I love film music, but I also love so much else about music. And so when I graduated and started doing my own things, I never really gravitated towards those sample libraries. I have a lot of them and I use them, but I use them more as supplements to the live instruments that I play in my studio. And the thing that I've started doing that I think makes my process really fun and maybe unique is that, cut me off if I'm rambling.
No, keep going. Keep going.
Yeah. In the beginning, film music used to be, okay, the composer, Alfred Newman at 20th Century Fox, would write everything by piano and by hand. And at the end, he would have an orchestra play it. And that was it. It was this like true collaboration between a composer and a director. And now we're going to write with our sample library. We're going to get the director in the studio to approve it. And then once everything's approved electronically, we'll record an orchestra at the end. Whereas my process, and something that I learned from a composer named Scott Salinas, who I interned for, was that he, at the beginning of each project, records 1 or 2 or 3 live musicians, like day 1 or 2, even before writing to picture, and then kind of uses those days of recording of maybe they were improvising together, maybe he had written a melody and some other themes. He then uses all of that material moving forward as kind of like the basis of which to write from. And so it becomes more like about electronic manipulation and of these live original sounds that nobody else has. And I just decided to take that one step forward, which I have a friend who's like a brilliant programmer for Contact. And so I record musicians at the beginning of each project, and then I give him all of that material, and he turns those into sample libraries that then are just like fully unique to me. So I'm still taking advantage of the sampling technology of being able to, play a keyboard and make it sound like these other instruments, but I'm starting from a place that is completely original and completely live, of players that, I've come to really respect and love collaborating with. And then moving forward, I have all of those libraries to use on whatever project that I do. So that's been my approach to trying to stay original, other than spending way too much money on analog synthesizers and other gear.
You know, those vintage Moogs, right?
Yeah.
You could spend 20 grand on one and it would sound awesome, but then you've just got a Moog rather than something, again, even more unique. That's a really interesting process.
Yeah, I like to put my hands on things though, you know. If it's in my studio and I can play with the knobs, it's more immersive to me than having it be on my computer.
Well, yeah, and there's a richness and a dynamic to the analog, whether it's an acoustic instrument or an analog synth, that is not present in a virtual instrument.
Yeah. It's funny though how that happens, because most of these virtual instruments do start out live, right? So it's like something gets lost in the process.
Well, yeah, I was reading a critique about the sample library process, and it was from an orchestrational perspective. And instruments have limitations not just in range, but in dynamics too. And when you're at the extremes of a tessitura or the range of an instrument, the sound is not the same as it is when they're in the middle registers. But when you sample that instrument, you kind of put everything at the same dynamic per, volume level or velocity setting, whatever, you know what I mean? So like you can still play the most high notes of any instrument you want that, if played live, especially if it's a wind instrument, would have to be really, really loud. But now you can play them very softly. So we've lost the nuances of what a true performance can be like.
Well, yeah. And I can't tell you how many times I've written something for like those beginning stages and the player comes in and it's just like, I can't play that, which is fine. Cause then you work together and figure out something that they can play.
Yep.
That's ends up being better than what you wrote. But the other thing is you don't get the overtones of the instruments interacting together. You can throw them all into the same reverb, but it's, so much of instrumentation and orchestration was based off of which instruments speak well together and which of them kind of, how do they blend? And, we've lost that completely.
Yeah.
But,
well, that's why orchestration and composition really is a lifelong study.
Yeah, I saw Randy Newman, who's a hero of mine, but he posted a song yesterday about the quarantine from his studio and just him playing a song on the piano, I think on Instagram or something. And if you look next to the piano, there was a Berg orchestration book just open halfway sitting there. And here's someone who's in their late 60s, early 70s and still studying. It's really inspiring.
Yeah, that is inspiring. This episode is sponsored by Dorico, the future of scoring. And we want to feature real Dorico users so you can know that real composers out in the world today are using Dorico to make their careers happen.
My name is Adam Schumacher. I'm an arts administrator and composer and professor. The more I learn, the more impressed I am. It's just like, oh, wow, they did it that way. That's so smart. Just the ability to start from no real commitment of key and meter, and then being able to make those changes on the fly without dire consequences was really a cool feature. It runs really well. I first launched Dorico on an 11-year-old iMac, and I really didn't have many problems notating in it, even with the old computer. Now that my setup's more modernized, it's been so fast and so fluid. It looks great and it feels great and it's easy to play off of as a performer. As a previous user of both of the mainstream notation softwares out there, I can highly recommend Dorico as a great solution for anybody entering the notation software world or looking to switch. Dorico just really took its time to figure out the best way to do things to service composers and arrangers and performers. It's really just the smarter way to notate your music, in my opinion. It's been a joy to use. Every time I'm trying to learn a new skill within Dorico, once I learn it, I'm like, oh, that was actually so much fun to learn. And I usually remember it and it sticks with me. And I feel like in the past, I've always been like, oh man, that was so cumbersome. But in Dorico, I have yet to run into something that I cannot do and not do easily. I feel supported by the software's capabilities. And also, the team too, the team behind Dorico, they're so attentive and helpful and ready to assist. They want to make this a great opportunity for everybody that's using it. And so I'm really pleased with the customer service behind the Dorico too.
The kind folks at Dorico have set up a special web page so you can go and download a free 30-day trial copy of Dorico. So go and do that. I have been using the program and I'm absolutely in love with it. Go to www.steinberg.net/TPC. You mentioned something a few minutes ago about studying at a place where there was this expectation of always pushing the envelope. Or that's not the words you used, but that's the vibe I got. Tell me more about that. Where did you do your undergrad and what was your experience there?
I did my undergrad at Princeton University, and I was looking at all these different conservatories for jazz performance. And I think right around the time I was applying, there was an article that came out about Princeton's jazz ensemble, and kind of became this romantic dream of mine to go to school there and to have a really strong jazz program, and also be able to study other things that I was interested in, interact with people that were studying things other than music. And then my senior year of high school, kind of right around that same time that I was applying, I had written like a jazz chart for our high school jazz band. And the head of the drama department heard it and asked if I wanted to write some music for her plays. And the first one was Dracula. And, I had no idea what I was doing. I said, sure. She set me up with someone who did music and sound design for theater in downtown Philadelphia. And I went to his loft and he talked to me about how to do it. And then it became me like sitting at a piano behind the curtain scoring Dracula live in our high school auditorium. And from that moment, I was just like, something clicked, and it became like, oh, this is what I want to do. I want to set music to drama and watch people's faces as they're like moved by drama, as opposed to doing jazz performance. And so from my first day at Princeton, I knew I was going to keep playing in the jazz bands, but I was on this mission to learn how to compose. And I think I just got really lucky in that Princeton's composition faculty were like these world-class composers like Steve Mackey, Paul Lansky, Dmitri Tomasko. These guys, are getting commissions from orchestras, and the music department was so small. There was 5 music majors my year. So you had kind of unlimited access to these people. And it was amazing. It was incredible to like get that kind of attention from these people. And it was really hard. I kind of talked my way into this study abroad program at the Royal College of Music in London. And I sat down with my composition professor there my first day, and he basically told me that I shouldn't have been there based off of like the knowledge that I had at that point.
Was he expecting you to be a capital N, capital M new music composer?
The exam to get in was basically like the delegate who I met in New York City who like was auditioning us, like played a 4-part Bach chorale on the piano, and we had to transcribe it. And, I probably got like 2 notes right, showed up to my ear training class in London, and everyone had perfect pitch except for me. And I really persuaded them that I would benefit from this program. And I think he was just saying like, most of my students that get here are like score the best on the music theory exams in England because they're more kind of specific about which students get those opportunities. And he was like, you shouldn't be here. Way less than I thought you would, but I'm going to help you. Like, here, go study these 6 scores and come back next week. And he kind of just walked me step by step so that by the end of that semester, I emerged like being able to write something for orchestra.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. So I owe a lot to him for sure.
That's great. Did you feel supported, not just by him, but the faculty at Princeton in the pursuit of doing media music? And as you said, kind of telling the story and the entertainment?
I didn't not feel supported, but I definitely felt like there was this attitude, even like outside of music for media, there was definitely this attitude of like someone who takes a couple of years to write a piece is more respected than someone like, Philip Glass, who's writing 1 million pieces a year. I think it was.
Yeah.
And then my senior year, I wrote a string quartet for my thesis, and my thesis advisor pulled me aside after the performance and was like, I think you should really reconsider going to grad school for media and think about like continuing to pursue maybe a PhD or something in academia. And that's something I still think about a lot. It's interesting that you talk about your experience with academia and maybe moving slightly away from that. Mm-hmm. But that was definitely like a crossroads in my life where I was like, well, I'm going to LA and I'm going to try and write for the movies. And, I think on certain days when I'm frustrated, or it's definitely a conversation that I think back to.
Well, and here you are scoring for media. Yeah. I guess you made your goal, right?
Yeah. Although I think, the way that you and I got connected through this new album is that something I kind of looked around at the people that were doing things for media that I, wanted to be like, or, role models of mine. And most of those people also had like their own artistic pursuits on the side that were clearly very important to them. Even someone like Johnny Greenwood, who's, one of my favorite composers for media, he probably does like one or less films per year because he's, writing for orchestras or touring with Radiohead. And I think for the type of composer and artist that I ultimately want to be, being able to develop my own voice and, music for media in some ways is very safe because at the end of the day, you're pitching music that a director says yes or no to. I think there's a couple, maybe less than 10, a handful of people who have a relationship with their director where the director fully trusts them to do what they want. But most of the time it's the director saying no or yes. And you kind of get into this rhythm of relying on the director to kind of be that voice inside your head that says like, is this good or not? Mm-hmm. And when you're making an album or you're just making music for yourself, that doesn't exist. You have to develop that yourself to the point where you're able to say, this is something that I think is good. This is something that I think represents me as an artist. And I think if I look at the artists and composers for media that I love, they're all so different from each other. I think because my theory is because they're doing their own thing and have had to kind of learn how to push and stand out as their own artists. So,
yeah. Well, when you're writing for media, like you said, you're not writing for yourself. You're telling somebody else's story. You're part of a team.
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest difference between concert music and media music.
Yeah. Although there's little tricks that you can play in your mind of, how can I find my way into this other person's story in a way that feels personal to me so that every time I sit down to work on a scene, it feels purposeful or it feels meaningful. And that's way harder on some projects than others,
Oh, I'm sure it is. But now you've done a project that is just for you, right?
Yes.
Tell us about that. Tell us about First Light. What is it and how did it come about?
Yeah, so I moved to LA and finished grad school. And then, I think you think that, okay, when you're sitting and growing up in Philadelphia, you're like, oh, I'm going to go learn how to write for the movies. And then someone's going to give me a movie. And that's just, not how it works, obviously. But there was a time when I didn't have any movies or TV shows to work on and felt kind of like I was floundering, maybe like flopping around and trying to figure out how to express myself as an artist in a way that would kind of attract the type of artist or director or filmmaker that was interested in hiring me to write something that I wanted to write, as opposed to someone who was looking for someone to hire to write something that they wanted to write. That makes sense?
Yes.
And it took me a long time to figure out what that was. In some ways, I feel like I'm still figuring it out. I have this whole other side of my career, which is like producing some pop artists. It took me a long time to realize that, like, even though that was something that I could do and maybe enjoy doing with the right type of person, it wasn't something that like I felt was truly meaningful to me. And when I think back on why I love music and why I think music is important, I come back to sitting in a concert hall and listening to a slower movement of a Mahler symphony and feeling my skin crawl and being reminded of, grandparents that I've lost and really difficult moments in my life and really joyous moments in my life. And for me, I think at this point in my life, at least that's where I've ended up, is that music is important to me because it helps connect me to emotions and remind me of, what it means to be alive, what it means to be human. And my goal was always to try and figure out how to express that on my own. And then one day, I was writing music for a TV show and was using this program called Paul Stretch, which would take a piece of music that I had written and stretch it out to this like kind of ethereal, weird sound. I mean, we've all heard, like, go and Google John Williams' Jurassic Park slowed down a million times, creates this kind of beautiful alien soundscape.
Yeah.
And for the most part, I would just take this 8-10 minute file from a 30-second piece and chop it up and then use it in the TV show. But then one day I slowed down a piece that I had written and I was just moved in a way that I hadn't been in a very long time from something that I had written. And I kind of attributed that to this sense of like, well, maybe there's some sort of higher power at work here, because it didn't feel like something I had written. It felt like someone else had written this,
Huh.
that's, I think one of the interesting things about using technology is that given the right process, you're leaving some things up to chance. And it just became this kind of clarity of I need to orchestrate this piece and explore where this came from and explore why this moved me. And I think as artists, I'm sure you can relate to this, but it's like you're constantly searching for clarity. Even, take like a given scene on a TV show. You write a melody, you start to orchestrate it, and you're like, why isn't this working? Why isn't this working? You're like, well, if I just fix this one thing, it will work. And then you decide finally to start over, and you're like, oh yeah, that wasn't the right thing. And there was something about this piece of music that just felt right to who I wanted to be as a musician and what I wanted to say.
Wow. And this was performed by a live orchestra, right? But it is also combined with electronic sounds. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah. So I took that wave file, that stereo wave file that was slowed down and orchestrated around it. So it's the combination of both of those things together. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. And this is being released on what label?
Ravello through Parma.
Nice.
And then there's a B side of another piece that I had been working. This album came together over 5 years, kind of in between times where I was doing movies or films, and had a couple other pieces that I was toying with pairing. And then just, I think thematically, the B side worked out in that both pieces to me feel like kind of an exploration of dark and light and inner torment and outer peace or inner peace and that kind of spiritual journey.
Cool. Well, I got to listen to a big portion of First Light, and it is very moving.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really good.
Thank you so much.
Your professors at Princeton would be proud of you. No, I said that half joking, but it is a great piece of music.
Well, feel free to send it along to them. No, I'm just kidding.
Dear Professor Mackey.
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. All right.
He's great. He's such a good composer.
Well, he's a great guy, too.
Yeah.
And his wife is a fantastic composer. Some of her music has just absolutely floored me, too.
Yeah. I was very fortunate to be involved in that community from a distance for a couple of years.
Well, one of the things I like to ask composers on this show is for one or two pieces of advice that they could give to the listeners, something actionable that they could start doing today that will move their career forward. What would you recommend?
I think that I'll approach that from two different angles. The first is I get this question a lot from people who want to write for film and TV. And it's really hard to find those jobs when you're starting out. It's hard to find those jobs at any point in your career. There just aren't that many film or TV shows, if you look at how many composers are out there. So I'd say if you're interested in writing for film and TV, start writing for film. Find a friend at your university who's a filmmaker. Find someone online who's making a short film. Find someone who directed a short film on YouTube that you like and reach out. There's just no duplicating the muscle of collaborating with a filmmaker and scoring to picture. And I think we have the benefit as musicians and composers that, if we're not an actor, we don't need someone else to write for us and then film us and perform us. We can make music. So even if you can't find a filmmaker, find a piece of film that you like and write music to it and post it online and just practice writing to picture. That's the first thing. The second thing would be similar, even though I was criticizing the program, similar to what it is at USC, like figure out how you can make yourself useful to someone who is doing something that you want to learn from. So, people ask to intern for me or ask to work for me, and I'm horrible at the technology side of it. So I always love when people really know Logic, really know analog synthesizers, really know MIDI routing, and can help kind of illuminate some of that process for me. And then, that's a job. Those jobs exist and those are paying jobs. Mm-hmm. And then not to be completely commercial and to end on maybe an artistic note is something that teacher, Ken Hesketh, told me when I got to the Royal College of Music, and his parting words of advice to me were don't settle, which is something that I was speaking a little bit about before. When you're in a scene and it doesn't feel right, and we've all been there where you've been working on an idea for hours, days, weeks, and in your gut, that it doesn't feel right, but you also are feeling lazy, like you've put so much work into it and you don't want to start over. But don't settle, get to that place where it feels right, because you'll get there. We always get there. We get to the place where you kind of like, oh yeah, this is what I want. This is the idea. And everything before this was just me putting my head down and grinding to get to this place. And the good news is that if you start a new idea, the old idea is still there on your hard drive. It's still there on the piece of paper. And I can't tell you how many times an idea that's not right for one scene or one movie ends up being perfect for something else. And I'm so thankful that my organization skills are passable to the point where I can find old ideas and repurpose them. In summary, don't settle. Get to a place where it feels good, and don't try and cram an idea into your concert piece, into your piece for TV, just because you're scared of starting over and starting the process anew.
Oh, that's a good piece of advice. It's very strong. That was well said.
Cool. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Jackson. This has been a really interesting discussion for me. I appreciate it.
Oh, I'm glad. I feel like I rambled and spoke way too much, but I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to do that.
My pleasure. Anytime. This episode of The Portfolio Composer has been supported by Dorico, the music notation software from Steinberg. Whether you're a composer or arranger, a teacher or student, working in music engraving and publishing, or working in producing music for media such as film, TV, and games, Dorico is the tool for you. Dorico comes in two versions: Dorico Pro for professionals and Dorico Elements, providing the perfect introduction to the world of scoring. Whichever version you choose, you'll be using software packed full of smart features that produces beautiful results completely automatically, allowing you to get music on the stand more quickly than with any other software. You can bring music into Dorico from your existing software using Music XML or MIDI, and you can try Dorico out completely free of charge for 30 days by downloading a trial version from dorico.com/TPC. Try it today.